Welcome. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and with Dr. Barbara Walter and Dr. Scott Gates, two of the real greats in this field of political violence and civil war and so on that we are sadly having to investigate nowadays. This is part of Carnegie's effort to really try to bring comparative expertise to bear on the United States and the situations that we're finding ourselves in. There is unfortunately quite a bit we can learn from the rest of the world at this point, and we want to bring that knowledge to bear. So with no further ado, Barbara Walter is a professor of political science in the Rohr Chair in Pacific International Relations at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. And she's one of the greats. She's expert on international security with a real emphasis on civil wars, and is on the editorial board of just about every publication in our field: American Political Science Review, International Organization, Journal of Politics, the Journal of Conflict Resolution and International Studies Quarterly. She and Erica Chenoweth, who will probably be here in some future date, co-founded the blog Political Violence at a Glance, which is one of the real places to see the up-and-coming research in this arena. And she did her PhD at University of Chicago and postdoc research at Harvard University and at the Institute of War and Peace in Columbia. And Scott Gates is a professor at the University of Oslo in Norway, joining us from across the pond. He's also a researcher at PRIO, which he directed for 12 years. The Peace Research Institute at Oslo is one of the locations for the most knowledge in this field. He's co-authored 8 books, numerous articles, a member of the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences and Letters. And he writes on issues from the rise of China to police brutality. So really a broad range in his 8 books that he co-authored and numerous articles. So we're going to really discuss the gamut here, starting with the global situation, turning to the United States, and then investigating policy solutions and other solutions that might be helpful here. So I want to start with you, Barbara, because your book is hot off the presses, and I know it's getting a lot of publicity here. You chose to write a popular book on civil war, and you're an academic. That's not generally a reward in academia to write a popular trade book. Why did you choose to write this book in this way for a lay audience?
Yeah. So when I started writing this book, I assumed that it was probably going to fall between the cracks, that it was neither going to appeal to an academic audience because it wasn't an academic book, nor would it appeal to a mass audience because it's got a lot of social science in it. And, it was probably more social sciencey than what people were interested in. And so it's been quite a surprise that people have been open to it and receptive to it. The reason I wrote it was really because of my policy work. I've been lucky enough to be able to consult with a bunch of agencies in DC and with the Department of Defense. And for the last 5 years, I've been on this task force called the Political Instability Task Force, which is run by the U.S. government. And the goal of the task force is in part to come up with a predictive model that helps our leaders predict where around the world political instability and violence is likely to break out. So I'm sitting on this task force, and we have this model that's actually very good. And we've figured out that 2 factors in particular are highly predictive. And these were actually not factors that we thought were going to matter as much. So we were quite surprised at the model that actually ended up being so powerful. The first factor is what we call Enocracy. And that's just a fancy term for partial democracy. It's governments that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. And the second factor is whether citizens in these partial democracies organize themselves politically around ethnicity, religion, or race, and not over any sort of ideology or political issues. So again, we developed this model because we're looking at every country outside the United States. We were not allowed to discuss the United States. It never came up. And as I'm sitting in these various conference rooms in suburban DC, I'm watching what's happening here in the United States, and I'm observing these 2 features emerge here. And so what motivated me to write this book was this I know how much really great research has been done on civil wars. I know how much we know, and yet that research is not accessible to American citizens or to our politicians. And so I really felt this responsibility to bring this research to the public in an accessible way, hoping that this would help America kind of turn itself around and help us avoid these really terrible outcomes that we do observe around the world.
Thank you. That's terrific. I want to get back to this point on Enocracy, so we're putting a pin in that right now. And Scott, I want to turn to you because, of course, there are trends going on right now that don't bode particularly well for violence. So, setting aside the United States for a minute, can you just share with us the system that we're falling into globally? Where are we now on trends in political violence, civil war, coups, and so on? And then I want to get to the algorithm that I know Priyo developed as well. So let's start with just the situational awareness.
So, in terms of coups, in the big peak for coups was in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And while in 2021 there were 7 coups, 5 successful and 2 unsuccessful, the previous years from 2015 to 2021 were just two coups at maximum, or 1. So in terms of coups, we're, except for this burst of coups in the Sahel, they're not that prevalent. But in terms of the different measures, that, at least from what the partner with Priyo is, the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, and using a pretty similar measure that Barbara is using, plus 25 battle deaths as counting as the conflict. Then they classify them in several different ways. One is what is labeled intrastate armed conflict, distinguishing it from interstate. So Ukraine is interstate, but looking at, and this would be most people are calling civil wars, and it involves the state. But they also, and right now, there is a record number of intrastate conflicts in the world. That's partly due to the nature of Islamic State and the coding rules used by Uppsala, because there'll be one operation of Islamic State that's operating in Chad and in Niger and in Nigeria and in Cameroon, but it's all counted as separate conflicts, even though, because it's a pairing, because Chad is in conflict with Islamic State, Nigeria, and so on. But that be as it may, there's considerable number of conflicts, and that's historical high number in a single year. And then we also have non-state violence, and that's probably something that I think is very relevant to the theme of that Barbara was writing about in her book, that you won't even necessarily have to have the state involved in the conflict, but you can have different non-state actors that are engaged with each other. And right now, there's 72 cases around the world of that kind of violence at plus 25 battle deaths. That's right now, that's the most extreme form of intrastate violence, but it's not involving the state. And then we have what's called one-sided violence, and that's either terrorism or it's state terror, where only one actor is perpetrating violence against civilians. And the number of those cases in the most recent year is 41. So we're talking about extensive forms of extensive, and you can have aspects of this, but generally we're talking about a huge amount of conflict that's occurring around the world right now.
So just to put all that in context, for many people of my generation in their sort of middle age, we went through a long period of relative peace in the world. After the end of the Cold War, civil wars fell. We saw reductions in coups and all these sorts of things. And now all of a sudden, we've had a 1-year spike in coups. Not clear if that's going to continue or not, but it's certainly a standout. Historical high of civil wars, 72 cases of non-state conflict where two groups are battling, and then violence from the state very much on the rise again. So this is the global situation. Now I want to delve into the nature of societies that are gearing up for political violence. So we'll look at societies, then we'll look at the state, then we'll turn to the United States. So I'm going to keep it more broad right now. So there used to be a big debate in our field about whether people started civil wars because they had grievances with the state, whether they were motivated by a desire for a larger slice of resources. But in both cases, the focus tended to be on groups that were marginalized, on the groups that were losing out, and on why they wanted more and what their reasonings were to get a fair shake from the state. But Barbara, you instead in your book talk about the dangers of groups that are losing status, which is almost the opposite side of the spectrum here. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this problem of status loss and how that feeds in versus these other groups that we used to think about a lot?
Yeah, so in the political science, we call these groups sons of the soil. And these are groups that had either once been politically dominant in a country, usually because they were the majority population, they were the population that was essentially there first or for the longest time, or they'd simply been in power for the longest. And it's these groups that tend to start ethnic civil wars when they are in decline. So if they have lost political power, or they anticipate that they're going to lose political power because demographically they're declining relative to other groups in society. And they start these wars because they do feel deeply aggrieved. So grievances play a role in why they're motivated to fight. But their grievances don't stem from the fact that they're the poorest groups in society, or they're suffering deeply from income inequality. They're aggrieved because of this deep sense of resentment, this notion that the country belongs to them. The identity of the country should be based on their culture, based on their religion, and this sense of almost righteousness that it's their right to rule. And so when they lose political power relative to another group, and oftentimes the other group are groups that have migrated into the territory, and they see them as interlopers, as foreigners, and not deserving of the status that they, the sons of the soil, believe that they should have. And they become particularly motivated to fight if this loss of political power also tends to be associated with a period of economic decline as well. And so you see this with the Muslims in Mindanao, which is the southern part of the Philippines. They had been the vast majority of people who lived there, and then Catholics from the northern Philippines started moving in, and are now the majority of the population and most of Mindanao. And they were given the best land by the government. They were given many of the best civil service jobs, and Muslims there saw their political position decline, and they saw that they actually, from an economic standpoint, also weren't living as well as these groups. And you've seen that in the Assam region of India. You see that in Israel with the Palestinians, although Israel is a really interesting case where I actually believe both the Palestinians and the Jews believe they are the sons of the soil of that territory, which probably makes that conflict so heated. And you saw this in Northern Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants. So it's a fairly typical pattern that we see historically and across the globe. And it's those types of groups that tend to be particularly motivated to organize and fight. And I should add, they also tend to have the better capacity to organize. If you're the poorest group in society, if you're recent immigrants, if you're heavily discriminated against, it's really, really hard for you to organize and sustain a movement because you often tend to be powerless, and the government often is able to suppress any movement. If you're the dominant group or the once dominant group, you often have the resources and the capacity to mobilize better than other groups in society.
Thank you. That was very, very clear. Scott, there are a lot of other variables that you consider in your own algorithm or in your own research that are societal. We'll get to governmental next, but can you speak to some of the other variables that increase risk for political violence in how societies are organized?
One of the strongest factors is, did you have civil war recently or interstate conflict? And actually, it's not recently. I mean, even back 20 years can be a huge risk factor. So that I mean, that's number one is, and right now, in dating back to all civil conflict going back to 1945, the end of World War II, 55% of the interstate conflicts were recurrences. And since 2000, we're almost 70%, 68% of all conflicts have recurred. So that's a strong association. Then, in addition, and this is probably a broader category than what Barbara was talking about, because there's no question Sons of the Soil or the dominant group is losing status is behind many conflicts. But there are cases where there are multi-ethnic conflicts, where different groups are in competition with each other. And then the one that's being mostly, it's focused not on economic disadvantage, being disadvantaged economically, but being politically subjected to a lack of right or being repressed and being targeted in repression. And in multi-ethnic societies, those groups, especially if they're long, not, as Barbara mentioned, the immigrant groups, but long-lasting minority groups within the society. Then state repression itself, a history of state repression more broadly, not just targeted to a group, would be a factor. In addition to what Barbara talks about with Enocracies, the murder in the middle, so to speak, where it's not autocracies, which are relatively, have the, you could say, the piece of a zoo, and democracies where there's representation and other avenues for expressing grievances, but in the middle where there's inadequate ways of addressing grievances, that we have problems, and a state that is not organized to create order in a way. But related to that, of the anocratic systems, is the movement from, and one of the most dangerous is moving from a full-fledged democracy and moving into the anocratic zone, where there's a feeling of a lack or a loss of political representation. That's problematic. It's not just being in the middle, but moving to the middle is even more problematic. And then wealth. One of the strongest results from almost any analysis is GDP per capita. Now, how that theoretically is associated with the correlation, different authors have different interpretations. Some will talk about opportunity costs of joining and becoming radicalized or engaging in conflict. And if you have a really good job, you're less likely to do that. But it's also a proxy for the state strength, the capabilities of the state to hold order and police adequately. Um, and then I guess a final one, which was very, very prominent in about 2000, is opportunities, loot. Um, so lootable resources, diamonds, and the diamond conflicts were a big feature of the turn of the millennium, and also narcotics. And we still see Mexico is racked with extreme levels of violence in association with narcotics.
Well, thank you. That's sort of the list of doom there. But one thing that didn't come up was leadership. And I know that this is a hard thing to push academics on because it's an individual factor and it's very hard to do quantitative research on leaders. And for many, many reasons, academics don't like to study personalities. But I do want to turn to the role of leadership, ethnic entrepreneurs, conflict entrepreneurs, and what they do in terms of building up or tamping down these social factors for violence. If you have a society that's got census soil that are declining, if you have these other factors of identity lining up, how do leaders exploit that or tamp it down? And Barbara, maybe you can speak to that first, and then Scott, if you have points to add.
Yeah. So the way I think about it, in a way that a lot of political scientists think about it, is the average citizen doesn't want war. The average citizen would much prefer to go about their daily life in peace, accumulate wealth, have a family. And so for violence to happen, you actually need individuals who are willing to organize it and who are willing to advocate for it. And Erica Chenoweth at the Kennedy School calls them violence entrepreneurs. But the same is true of ethnic factionalism and ethnic parties. People don't naturally gravitate towards creating ethnic parties. That has to be fomented. That has to be generated. And if you think about Sarajevo during the war in the former Yugoslavia, Sarajevo was this incredibly cosmopolitan city. It was multi-ethnic, multi-religious. There was very, very high intermarriage rates. If somebody said that in a few years these people were going to start killing each other, it would have been inconceivable. And in fact, I've interviewed a lot of people who were there in the months before the outbreak of war, and they say they still can't believe that it happened. And yet what you see is, in times of change and in times of uncertainty, when people are feeling a little bit untethered, a little bit insecure, they can be manipulated by elites, by individuals. We call them ethnic entrepreneurs. They can be manipulated by these types of individuals to begin to band together because they're convinced by these ethnic entrepreneurs that if they don't do that, their safety and the safety of their families is threatened. And of course, the classic ethnic entrepreneur is Slobodan Milosevic, who emerged in the early 1990s. He was a former member of the Communist Party. He suddenly was facing these competitive elections in Yugoslavia. This was a problem for him. He knew that if he ran as a communist, which is what he was, that Yugoslavs would not vote for him. And they wouldn't vote for him because they didn't like communists. And they knew that Milosevic was a communist. And so he was very, very politically savvy. And he realized that the biggest ethnic group in Yugoslavia were the Serbs, and he was a Serb. And so he became this rabid ethnic entrepreneur where, because he controlled state radio and because he controlled state TV, he was able to put out this constant message of fear-mongering and this constant message that Serbs were threatened in this environment. And if they didn't band together in their own party, and if they didn't back a Serb, and if they didn't get a Serb elected into power, the Croats were going to do this. And if the Croats were successful, they would kick Serbs out of their jobs, kick them out of the military, and possibly even begin to kill them the way they had done or at least some of them had done during World War II. And so Milosevic was one of these individuals. Tudjman was his counterpart on the Croat side, who realized that playing to people's fears and insecurities and convincing them that they have to band together in these sort of tribal ways could be very, very effective in catapulting them to power. So, Rachel, I completely agree with you that individuals do play a really big role in mobilizing these ethnic factions, and then also in mobilizing average citizens in the months leading up to the actual use of violence.
Terrific. Scott, I want to turn to you. I just want to pull on two threads that Barbara said. First was that the leaders don't have to believe what they're doing. There's, so much talk in America. Do they believe this? Do they believe, trying to sort of get into the minds of leaders? It really doesn't matter. It's a strategy. And if the strategy works and they're following the strategy, what they feel in their heart of hearts might not particularly matter. And the other point that you were making, but I just want to draw it out, is that psychologically, most people don't want to commit violence, and they do so defensively rather than offensively. But you can convince people that they're being defensive against an enemy far before that enemy starts to attack. And so this sense of threat that can get conjured up, that can make a normal person feel they have to defend their homeland, defend their people, their wives and children, and so on, can be extremely potent when leaders pull on that. Scott, do you have anything to add to this leadership conversation?
I have one point to make, and it's reflected in the story about Milosevic, and that is, and it also would reflect almost any leader, but often these entrepreneurs of violence are benefiting from the violence. They are in a position where they're much more benefited than through ordinary political channels. And so they're actually going to benefit out of the conflict. And I think that's an important point to underline in this whole thing. So whether you're the leader of a Lord's Resistance Army or what happened in the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the leader is perpetrating these actions of trying to mobilize and recruit and instigate the violence. They're benefiting from that system.
Thank you. It's a really important point to pull out. And when we turn to America, I want to talk a little bit about that, because there's monetary benefit as well as other forms. But first, before we get to the United States, I want to turn to the nature of the state, because we've talked about the nature of society. But as Scott said, wealthy states rarely have civil wars. So there's a factor on the other side that pushes toward resilience. States that don't repress their people are much less likely to have civil war. So that gives some room to human agency in the state. Scott, you've written on police brutality and the security services in many cases here. And can you just expand a little bit on how the state reacts to threat or violent groups, what role that plays in increasing or reducing the likelihood of violence?
Well, I think if there is a systematic targeting by the police, there's going to be that, going back to what I was talking about with politically repressed groups, that's going to be problematic and create a distrust in the state and the police force and the security apparatus of the state. All related to that is the sanctioning of violence. In your book, A Savage Order, you have a good section about post-US Civil War and the sanctioning of lynchings, and where the local leaders, especially when Johnson's president before Grant comes in, that there's a widespread sanctioning of violence against the newly freed Blacks, and countless amounts of extreme violence that is used to intimidate or to punish and other activities. And that, I mean, this is, in that context, the violence that's post-Civil War, but in our counting of 35 battle deaths, it would be, but in that case, it isn't the state that was engaged, it was the kind of the state allowing the violence to occur.
Absolutely. And I think, in my own research, I talk a lot about this alignment between private violence and how states allow or disallow that private violence. And there's some wonderful work on Germany and Italy during the years of lead in Italy versus the 1968 kind of riots in Germany, and how Germany's restraint and how it handled those riots reduced the violence, whereas Italy's violent reactions to its own student riots led to the years of lead, among other things. We're already getting questions from the audience before I even did the call out, which I was going to do at the half hour. So I will now do the call out. We would love more questions from the audience. We'll get to them in the last 15 minutes or so, maybe 20. And please ask about these general civil war and political violence issues, or about the United States, and we'll get to them soon. But before we turn to the US, I really want to get into this issue of enocracy. Scott brought it up. It's in your book, Barbara. There is a theory in our field, which is pretty well established with the research. There is more murder in the middle. And more murder in the middle basically means that highly repressive governments can keep violence down, although I question how much they're keeping it down because of violence from the state, but certainly amongst regular folks. And democracies, full liberal democracies, tend to have very low levels of political violence. But this middle group, which we call enocracies, I was told in my Atlantic article not to use that word, that no one would read a book that had the word enocracy in it. No one would read an article. And here you've written a best-selling book that has the word enocracy in it. So can you explain the issue with enocracy, and particularly the issue of moving toward enocracy from democracy that Scott brought up, and why that's so dangerous?
Yeah, and Scott's absolutely right that it's these transitions that are particularly destabilizing, and rapid transitions where you have a 5 or more shift on the polity scale. I think in 5 years are particularly troubling. So this is a very robust finding. Nobody is really questioning at this point in time whether this is actually true, that these rapid transitions into the middle zone are the times when you tend to get political violence and civil war. What people are now grappling with is the question of why. And there are lots and lots of theories, but right now we have no evidence, or we have a little bit of evidence proving one theory over the other. But the question is, what is it about these transitions? Is it that people are losing power, and the people who are losing power are particularly angry? Is it because these rapid transitions really are just a proxy for governments that are weak, and therefore they're vulnerable to being challenged? So what is it? And there was some really good research by a political scientist at Essex, Christian Gleditch, who's done yeoman's work in terms of helping us to understand almost every possible aspect of civil wars. And he was trying to tease this out. And his conclusion, and his co-authors' conclusions, were that these regimes are not particularly strong. There's infighting amongst the people who are there. The institutions are changing. If you're transitioning from an authoritarian country into the middle zone, think about Iraq after Saddam Hussein was deposed. You had a rapid attempt to democratize Iraq. And really what you had on the ground, though, was a government that didn't have the capacity to even deliver social services to its people anymore, let alone protection. And so you had almost a bit of anarchy in the country. And if you're an ambitious political entrepreneur and you've been waiting to try to grab power, these rapid transitions are an opportunity for you to do that. If you're transitioning rapidly from democracy down to the middle zone, you also are having governments that are changing quite rapidly. The guardrails are coming off. One group is trying to rapidly consolidate power, and of course this represents almost the opposite, the window of opportunity for you to to try to prevent this is closing, because as the party that's trying to consolidate power is able to do that, they're also likely to be investing more in the repressive arm of the state in order to protect their position. And so those rapid transitions, we think, represent a period of time where those who are losing power realize this, we have to act now, or that window is going to close.
So I now want to turn to the United States. And based on what you just said, things don't look very good, because on every major measure of international democracy, the US is showing decline, and it's quite swift decline. I sit on the board of Freedom House. We showed the United States on one of the fastest downward trajectories of any country that we rank democratically. We're now ranked, the US is now ranked along Romania and Croatia, and that's a very bipartisan effort, I should add. Varieties of Democracy Index, which is international, shows the sharp autocratization since 2010. The Economist Intelligence Unit downgraded the US to a flawed democracy in 2017. Europe's International Idea classifies us as a backsliding democracy. So that's not good from these standpoints. And I know the Enocracy Index has pushed America into that indice. Some folks contest whether that index is right or not, but there's clearly a slide. So Scott, I want you to play the role of what are the factors of resilience here? What's in our favor in the United States in terms of the likelihood of political violence? And then Barbara, I would like you to play the other role about what are the risks, and when you apply this line of thinking to the US, can you bring out the risks? And we have a question about fractionalized politics and whether that's been dropped from the variables, but if you could address factionalized politics in the US, that'd be great. So Scott, you first on resilience factors.
So the positives for the US, I would say that despite the problems that we're talking about, there's a long history of democratic values. Most of the leaders express a desire and an honoring of those democratic values. Most of the people, the population, wants and supports those democratic institutions. The notions related to different aspects of the US government have a degree of stability and resilience and support.
Sorry, I'll just add in there that you already brought up the factors of wealth and GDP that
those would be.
Likely.
I was thinking purely on political institutions.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm going to give the whole gamut. So, there's the wealth factors, there's the factors that you've brought up. We had a civil war, which puts us at more risk, but we haven't had one for many, many decades, which puts us at less risk.
Yeah.
So when you're sort of
though I will say, if we're talking about political violence, there's a lot of it. I will also say that with regard to all of these measures, there is a peculiar bias because they're rating pre-Voting Rights Act US with systematic disenfranchisement of the Black population in the US as being a more democratic system. And at least for some states, I would argue that there was less democracy pre-66 or pre-65 in Mississippi or Alabama than there is now, despite problems because there were still problems gerrymandering and excessive populism, to put it bluntly. But in addition to those things, there was systematic disenfranchisement, more systematic than what's being threatened right now. So I just want to put that little fly in the ointment, so to speak.
Yes. No, I think that a lot of us who look at that Enocracy number now think, really? It's worse now than it was pre-65? That seems like folks now wanting to read things in. But there are these other factors pushing, all these other indices pushing toward that. So we probably shouldn't make too much of the number, but we also shouldn't be too complacent about where we stand in the slide. Okay, so those are the resilience factors, and the U.S. has a number of them. Barbara, can you speak to the risk factors that you've talked to about already, and also this factionalization and how those apply in the U.S.?
Yeah. So the task force looks at countries around the world, and if they have these two factors, if they are in the Enocracy zone, if they're partial democracies, and they have political parties that are identity based and predatory, which means that they're seeking political power in order to exclude everybody else, the task force puts these countries on a watch list. And they hand this list over to the White House, and my guess is to DOD, and the countries are observed to see whether they're going to unravel or not in some way. So by the end of 2020, if the task force had been allowed to observe the United States, we would have had those features and we would have been put on this watch list. And the watch list means that a country is at high risk of political instability and political violence. I'll talk in a second about what high risk means, because that's really important to get correct. But this is what has happened in the United States based on these two measures. In 2016, the Center for Systemic Peace, which is the nonprofit organization that measures Enocracy, that has this polity scale, it downgraded the United States from a 10, positive 10, which is the most democratic type of country, to a positive 8. Positive 8, you're still considered a full democracy, but there's some issues with your democracy. And the reason why the center downgraded the US in 2016, there were a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was because international election observers who were here to monitor the elections, they deemed our election free, but not entirely fair. And it was not entirely fair because there was both partisan meddling at the local level in terms of how the elections were run, but there was also international meddling in the elections. Our own intelligence agencies confirmed that Russia had, in fact, attempted to meddle in those elections, and so our democracy was downgraded. The center downgraded the US again in 2019 from a positive 8 to a positive 7. That's still considered a full democracy. And the reason the center downgraded it then was because the executive branch of our government refused to comply with requests for information from the legislative branch and refused to comply with subpoenas. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal because the main check on executive power here in the United States is Congress. And if the president ignores oversight by Congress, the president is essentially running roughshod over one of the main branches of government. And so we were downgraded again then. Excuse me, I've been talking a lot this week. And then by the end of 2020, the US was downgraded once again to +5. And this put the US for the first time since 1800 in this Enocracy zone. And the reason for that was because we had a sitting president who was refusing to accept the results of an election and was actively attempting to overturn them. So that is clearly anti-democratic. And the US's rating as a democracy by the center was reduced as a result. And then if you look at the ethnic factionalism measure, the way it's measured, the Republican Party or white Americans were in as late as 2008, white Americans were almost equally likely to vote for Democrats as they were to vote for Republicans. And that began to change when Barack Obama was elected. In 2008, the white working class began to gravitate from the Democratic Party, which had been sort of their natural home. Democratic policies tend to align more squarely with the policy preferences and the needs of the working class. But starting in 2008, the white working class began to gravitate towards the Republican Party to the point where today the Republican Party is 90% white and predominantly evangelical Christian. And this, of course, is one of two major parties in a country that is multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So by the definition that we use about what is an ethnic faction, the Republican Party today is an ethnic faction.
Well, that's pretty clear. I want to get into later the shape of violence and what we're sort of expecting to see. As Scott mentioned, America already has pretty high levels of political violence, but also just regular violence compared to our democratic peers at this level of wealth. So I want to hold that for a minute and get into policy because we have 15 minutes left. We've got questions from the audience, and I want to bring the first one in. So America's on this downward slide. Whether you think that we're on as downward a slide or not as downward a slide, it's pretty clear that the democracy is declining to one degree or another, and the risk factors are increasing. But as you were saying earlier, I think you were saying, I might have read it in your book and been interpolating it here, there is room for human agency here. These things are not inevitable, and there are things that can be done. And so one of our audience members says, they're charging and convicting the January 6th insurrectionists. Problem solved. Is that enough? So can you speak to this role of accountability from the state and what that does to the problem? And then I want to get into economic and other policy issues. So I guess Scott and then Barbara, just to keep the back and forth going.
Okay, I will first address the January 6th. There's much more in the litany of criteria that Barbara was listing for degrading the U.S. Democratic score. There is a quite significant distrust in the sanctity of elections, related to gerrymandering, related to trusting the votes and the counting of the votes, and all of those factors. And there's evidence for, especially with the gerrymandering, of the manipulation of the system to trying to, where very sophisticated systems are applied to voting potential, and then the boundaries for congressional districts are being redrawn to favor one party or the other. And a vast majority of the public is opposed to those kinds of partisan boundary drawing. The problem is instituting it and taking that away from the parties. Michigan had a referendum to take away that power, but it's the independent agency hasn't been able to effectively take control, really, of the system in Michigan, as an example.
Absolutely. And I was actually on the phone with a number of Michigan election officials yesterday about just how much pressure there is on the system in Michigan in particular, as well as the militia organizing.
And it's not the most egregious. Wisconsin is extremely, especially the Republican legislature in Wisconsin, is pushing, and primarily towards basically the falsehood that Trump lost the election, and about phantom votes and whatnot.
So January 6th, Barbara, is it enough to arrest and convict these insurrectionists or not?
So this is a fantastic question. It is important, but it's not nearly enough. The FBI, I'm sure, is doing a whole series of things to try to infiltrate these groups, to shut down their ability to recruit. So you could think of January 6th. It could have been the beginning of a series of more and more types of I don't want to call it insurrections, but attacks by some of the far right groups, or it could have been sort of the end. And I think it's actually something in between. I think the fact that the leaders are being arrested and they're being brought to justice is going to put a damper on this. But that's exactly what happened in 1996 after the Timothy McVeigh bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. 1996 was the height of the militia movement in the United States until recently. Most people don't know that. Militias had been growing over time, and they peaked in 1996. The reason they reversed after that was because the American people and the US government was so horrified by this attack that they did throw the FBI into dealing with this problem, and they did so quite effectively. In fact, Merrick Garland was head of, I believe, I don't know if he was part of the FBI then, but he was behind the measures taken to reduce militias, and it was very effective. And then militias started growing again in 2008, and we're now at a new peak. And in part, those militias were allowed to grow because the U.S. was distracted with fighting what we believed was the bigger threat to the United States, which was foreign terrorists. And for a long period of time, both Democrats and Republicans didn't want to acknowledge that we actually had a bigger domestic terrorism problem. And January 6th actually made it clear to them that we need to begin to address this. But again, as long as these two underlying factors continue to exist here in the United States, as long as we have a weak democracy and a democracy that could easily slide back into anocracy, and as long as one of our major parties continues to want to represent only a declining portion of the U.S. population, those underlying conditions and risk factors will continue. So the task on the task force, we know that if you get put on this watch list, those countries have about a 4% annual risk of civil war. Again, that seems small, but it's actually not. It means that every year that those two conditions continue to exist, the risk increases, so that after 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the risk is actually very, very high. So it's great that the FBI is going after the far right. They should have been doing this, 10 years ago. But it's great that they're doing this now. It's going to have an effect. But again, as long as those underlying conditions are around, when there's an opportunity, you'll see the rise of militias. You'll see these actors who are deeply dissatisfied with the current system emerge again.
Thank you. That was excellent. And I think this accountability issue is crucial, that you have a societal demand that's continuing and you can tamp, but have to deal with some of these deeper causes. We have two questions I want to get to. First, is the GOP a losing white faction if it's very likely to win in the next election? Control of both houses. Latinos are starting to vote for the GOP. Some of that might have to do with foreign manipulation, but some of it clearly has to do with values-based decisions. And so, it's not necessarily true forever that they become the party that is white and losing, nor is it necessarily true that people stay white. I speak here as a Jew. We became white over time and began being seen as part of the majority. Some Hispanics might be doing the same thing in the move into the GOP as kind of a bid for that majority status. So the first question, is the GOP a losing white faction, or does it not really fall into that if it starts winning? And then another question, and the first one will go to you, Barbara, and the second one to Scott, is that a major measure of democratic fallback is criminalizing the opposition. And a lot of us are grappling with, what do you do if Trump actually committed criminal acts, or other members of the cabinet or what have you actually did do things that are prima facie criminal, if you don't want to further lose your democracy by criminalizing the opposition. So Barbara, if you could take the first question, and then Scott can think on the second.
So if the GOP thought it could win elections, if its strategy in 2022 moving forward over the next few years was to widen its tent and be more inclusive, then it wouldn't have to pursue all of these undemocratic measures, these voter suppression measures that it has been pursuing. So that gives you a hint as to what their strategy is going to be. If you think that you're going to be able to attract a more diverse set of voters and therefore increase your voting base, then you don't have to try to institute voter ID laws. You don't have to try to make it really, really hard to vote in places like Texas. You don't have to try to put in loyalists as electors in swing states like Pennsylvania. Those undemocratic measures are unnecessary if you believe that your party is going to grow, and the GOP would grow if it would be more inclusive, but it's not doing that. So it suggests that it's going to be an ethnic faction, at least for the short term.
Thanks, Barbara. And Scott, can you take on this issue of criminalizing the opposition?
Well, I can see where the question's coming from, but I think that let's take like the 6th of January. Illegal acts were committed, and where there is illegal behavior, it should be prosecuted. That's going to be an essence of preserving the democracy, and backing away from exercising the criminal nature of certain actions is problematic. In the same way that there's corruption or other kinds of election fraud, those should be prosecuted. And the use of violence definitely should be. And this gets back to what I talked about in referencing your work about the sanctioning of violence, where the government steps aside and lets private actors commit the violence. That's problematic, and it should be prosecuted.
Now, another strain of thought talks about economic solutions, that, if we can improve the economy for different groups, maybe that can help. I venture to say that the Biden administration might have thought that Build Back Better and some of its policies were trying to address this democratic slide through economic means. Can you speak to that?
You want me to?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'll go first to Barbara, and then Scott, I'll have another question for you.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why the Democrats lost the white working class was that neither party was actually addressing their needs. Bill Clinton signed NAFTA, and on average, Americans benefited from free trade. But there were losers in that process, and people who had manufacturing jobs, good union jobs that allowed them to live solid middle class lives, they lost those jobs and then they never came back. And neither party instituted a social safety net that would help that subset of Americans who was suffering as a result of NAFTA. They didn't institute those policies. And so if you're a white, for a coal miner in West Virginia, and you're seeing your life decline and neither party is helping you, the Republican parties did a good job sort of appealing to them in different ways, and appealing to them in part through white racial identity. Now, Rachel, I've kind of forgotten your question.
So now, and then I'm going to do a speed round with just 1 minute each about your favorite policy interventions. But,
okay.
Is economic assistance or a social safety net a useful intervention at this stage in risk?
Yes, but it's not as important as political reform. It's a stopgap measure. In fact, when you study where civil wars tend to recur, and you include measures of good governance, poverty and income inequality, they actually no longer are significant. So what becomes really important is for citizens to believe and trust that their political system is working for them, and that they have a voice in that. Taking care of people who are marginalized is important. It reduces grievances, and certainly it would help the Democrats bring some of these voters back into the Democratic tent. But it's not. I would argue it's not even the most important factor.
So we have 1 minute left, and in the last 30 seconds for each of you, I'd love for you just to say, at this stage of risk with the United States, first of all, on a 1 to 10, how worried are you, with 10 being the most? And second of all, what would you do if you were an official who could make some policy to change the situation? Scott, why don't we go to you first?
Okay. I think I do agree that the economic reforms that would be necessary in the U.S. are just going to be so drastic. You're not going to create so-called Denmark instantaneously. But I do think that shoring up the democratic institutions is possible. And I would basically take away partisan redistricting, limiting gerrymandering. And I also think that there's a gap in the Democratic Party in appreciating not only the working class, but rural America, and rural American issues should be taking top priority for the Democratic Party.
And Barbara, if you were to lessen the risk, how worried are you, and what would you try to do?
I mean, I would put it probably at a 7 out of 10. And the one thing, I think the easiest thing that we can do that would have enormous implications for at least halting or slowing down democratic decline, not just here in the US, but across liberal democracies around the world, and in reducing ethnic factionalism and ethnic nationalism, would be to regulate social media. Regulate social media. And I actually think that would be the easiest thing and would have pretty immediate effects.
Well, we need to have a whole nother conversation about the social media issue and the traditional media issue, since the research shows that it affects countries based on how it falls into their media system, and ours is particularly ill-suited to handle it with the decline of local media and so on. So we will save that for a different conversation. We're already a minute over. Thank you so much, Barbara and Scott, for joining for this important conversation. And I wish you luck in both your work.
Yeah.
Thank
you, Rachel, and thank you, Scott.
Take care.
Bye.